Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Day in the Life. We put together an all-star panel here to talk about a little bit of what it is actually like being in the dev world, in the real world of dev. So, first up, I want to introduce my lovely panelists. So, starting off with Leigh, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your current role.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Leigh Harris, and I'm an associate lead game designer at Wargaming in Sydney. And previous to that, I've been in games my entire career, but I started off doing PR for Rockstar Games and then went indie. Myself and my big sister made our own studio called Flat Earth Games. We released about half a dozen or so games over the course of 10 years. And I did a little bit of other stuff in between that. I was a games journalist for a little while. I was teaching game design, sort of part-time things in order to make sure I could still pay rent because, sometimes games are selling like hotcakes and then other times they're not. So we had to make that work somehow. And yeah, now I'm at a AAA studio working on something I can't talk about.
Always the way with AAA. I'm just like, I'm working on so many exciting things. Everything's under NDA. I'll go to Kelsey next.
Hey, I'm Kelsey. I'm currently the head of community at Immutable, a studio in Sydney, working on a game called Gods Unchained. Before that, I was at Bethesda doing communications there, and I've also worked at EB Games and a couple of other places as community manager. I think that's me.
All right, and Angus.
Hey, I'm Angus, and I'm a freelance pixel artist. I've been doing that ever since I finished university 8 years ago. I've worked on pretty much exclusively indie games, and recently released a pretty successful game, Unpacking, where I was the lead pixel artist.
Just a small title under your belt there, Angus. Just just a BAFTA award-winning title. All right, and Cyrian.
Hello, I'm Cyrian Guillaume. I'm the art director at Cyberpunk. I graduated with a Bachelor of Animation. And yeah, I've shipped about 6 games in the last 5 years. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Fantastic. All right, so let's get stuck in. So starting with Kelsey, what does a typical day look like for you?
I always hate that question, but love it at the same time. It's such a difficult one to answer. So a typical day, I guess, in and of itself is a bit of a random question to get, because especially as a community manager, it is literally different every single day. I'm doing interviews at the moment for people to join my team. And every time someone asks me that question, I'll just tell them what I did that day. And every day it's been different. Today I spent all day in Discord because we had an update, and everything was on fire, so I had to put things out. But yesterday looked entirely different, and that's part of the beauty of community management, I think.
So I'll throw to the rest of the panel now. What does a typical day look like for you?
I guess I'll go. Yeah, I think like Kelsey said, every day is very different. I also think it's very particular to the structure that you work in. If you work in a AAA studio versus an indie studio, I feel like in an indie studio, you'll tend to be wearing many, many hats in one day. So for me, it's mostly, I do have a repeating structure, which is sort of like, okay, come in, I check the calendar to make sure that I haven't forgotten about any meetings, which, I do have a few of. And then I'll sort of check in the team. We'll have a daily stand-up where we talk about what we do during the day. And after that, I'll just move on to checking the backlog, the tasks that we have to do for the day. And, every couple of days or so, I'll check in with the directors and the art team to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And if I have any questions or concerns with the schedule or production, I'll just go to our producer and try to solve as many of these as I can. Otherwise, it's fair game. In a normal day, I could be doing level design, or I could be doing UI mockups. I could be having like a full day of just production meetings to try and work with our publisher. So it is really, really different day to day, at least in my experience.
I think I had a really similar experience to to you when I was working on my own studio, there'd be like a few rituals that we would do, but the days would just vary wildly. Sometimes it was level design or economy design or UI design, or yeah, spending a whole day just trying to put a pitch deck together to the publisher so that they're happy and are, you know, going to continue to give you little bits of money to make your game. But the shift over to where I'm at now has meant that a lot of things are kind of similar, but a lot of the extra things that were required at an indie level are less prominent. And what I've found is that as I've been working here, and as I've been taking on more responsibility, I've had less time for hands-on design. So the kind of things that I'll be doing on a day-to-day basis involve a lot more of trying to like gather everyone's opinions about the design of a feature that we're working on, get everyone's concerns or objections, and then represent as a whole those objections or concerns to you know, the design director who's not in this studio, but is in the UK studio. So trying to synthesize everything that we need to have answered or confirmed so that we can continue to do design work on our end. So it gets rarer and rarer that I can just sit down with headphones on and spend like half a day playing around with vehicle physics or something cool like that. But there's also a lot of joy to be had in doing the stuff that I do. But it's kind of different to from one designer to another. Some people really prefer to just bury their head in numbers, and you couldn't drag them into a meeting, you know, on pain of death. They just wouldn't have it. And so we always sort of change what people do based on what they gravitate towards.
Cool. Yeah, for me, my days actually do end up very similar, unlike a lot of other people, because I'm a freelancer. Typically when I get hired, it's to do something really specific, which in my case is make pixel art assets. So most of my days, honestly, they start with me making sure I have work to do. And then I just go through that list and I'm just making art all day, every day. That's pretty much my job.
The dream.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Something that I find that is really interesting about like the actual like the modern game development is so much of it is problem solving. That is the thing that you come into, like that constant terms of like everyone resonates with that "this is fine" Doug, like as a daily basis of just like putting out the latest fires. But it's really cool to me that Angus, like you're the fire extinguisher. Like you are the, like, you know, all right, we've got with one job, Angus is going to come in. We know what this fire is. We know that he puts out this fire. We're going to get him straight in there, like, which is super cool.
Yeah, I think that was something interesting when I was working on Unpacking was everyone else on the team, like for most of the development, I was the only contractor on the team. So everyone else on the team was wearing many hats and doing lots of things. And I think it was me there every day. I was doing the art. And if there was one thing that was consistently happening on the game, it was that the art was coming in. Like that was always evolving. And that was like, I think useful for everyone to have as a driving force behind the development of the project, just to have that consistent, like, art's coming in, we have to get ahead of it. So, yeah.
Fantastic. All right. So our next question I have is, and this one I'm going to point at Cyrian, is what did your first day look like? And then what did your 100th day look like? And a little bit about sort of what the differences are between those two.
Sure. So I think I would start with talking about, I think everyone gets that on the first day at a new job. You know, you're quite intimidated, sometimes terrified. I think in the context of game development, especially, you can feel even more terrified because you know that jobs are difficult to get into. And when you do get one, you really want to be doing good. So yeah, I was completely terrified, mortified. I wouldn't ask any questions just because I didn't want to be the new annoying employee. So I was really keeping to myself. As a whole, though, I think we didn't have much sort of structure at the start. We didn't have regular conversations, you know, like I didn't really get anyone checking on me. So it was very free-forming, kind of a little bit chaotic sometimes. But yeah, I think compare that to the 100th day that I had, which is like, by that point, we've had much better communication across the board. We've had processes in place. We've had guidelines. So how to talk about things that, you know, if you have feedback, sometimes that can be quite difficult, especially if it's about art. You know, I think a lot of artists, do receive feedback, and sometimes that feedback can be quite painful, especially if you're a young artist. So a big difference for me was sort of getting used to getting feedback and understanding that my work and who I am as a person are different things. So not taking things too personally, but also just having more regular checkups and a much better structure in terms of, compared to the first day, where I think we literally, on the first day, we started doing work and I stomped over someone else's work because they didn't mention that they were working on the same thing as me. Whereas 100 days later, it's like, okay, I know exactly who's doing what at all times. So that doesn't happen anymore and no work is wasted. But I think the main thing is definitely structure has been established.
I think there's the flip side of what you're talking about as well is that you learn to get better at giving feedback. And I think the day 1 versus day 100, the difference was kind of stark just in terms of how I would approach it in terms of syntax. I would always have like a very careful way of bringing it up and signaling that I was about to give feedback just before I actually did. But I think the more I've gone down that rabbit hole of exactly how one can phrase constructive criticism or positive feedback even, the more I've realized that the important thing is that it's coming from a good place. And if you're someone who exudes that you're trying to help someone, chances are the words will follow. And if it's coming from a bad place, it doesn't matter if you use all the best language in the book, you're going to make people upset.
That's a really good point as well. I think in general, things coming from a good place. Cyrian kind of mentioned that he was afraid to ask questions on the first day. And I remember very much being the person, sitting in a meeting, being terrified to speak up and say anything. What I've found now, I don't think it's day 100. I think it's like day 1,000 for me now, probably even more. That people that ask questions and people that speak up, I always think nothing but good things of those people. Like if someone starts their job and in their first week, they're asking me like 300 questions a day, I'm like, wow, they're really engaged. They're really active. I never think that thing that I used to feel on day 1, that I would be annoying everyone or that I would somehow, display to the world that I didn't know the answers. It's like, no, actually no one knows the answers. The thing for day 100 is for me realizing that none of us ever really know what we're doing. We're all just working it out. And if you ask the questions, it actually is a very good thing, I think.
It is funny that like, the longer I do what I do, the more my first meeting with someone will be me asking the most basic questions that maybe a beginner might think makes them sound inexperienced. But for me, I know that like, if I don't get this information now, that's going to be hours of my time. I'm sitting there stressed out, like, what's the best way to do this when somebody else might just be able to tell you what you need to do. So yeah, definitely. If you're new in any situation, which happens to me a lot as a freelancer, just being comfortable with asking what seem like really basic questions is important, because every studio does things differently, and you can't really be expected to know what that's like until you get into it. So yeah.
I had Ali McLean as a producer here for a while, and she led by example in a really awesome way, where she would be completely unafraid of just asking engineers to describe things to her as though she was a 5-year-old child, like really, really just staring them dead in the eyes and going, I'm not going to understand this unless you make it really, really simple. And it just made sure, like you said, it's going to cost you hours and hours in the future if you don't understand the decision that you're making now. So pushing past that barrier is important. But I think that demonstrating pushing past that barrier in a really public way and being unafraid to set the standard for new and junior people is just as important.
Yeah, brilliant. This touches upon so many massive points that in my work, I work with a lot of students, and there's a lot of sort of core principles that I try to teach them. And one of them is ask good questions, because you get into a much more positive place, because you basically, if you ask good questions constantly, the person you're asking it to, you are making them feel like the expert. So they will appreciate you because you chose them to ask that question to. So they will see you as someone who admires them or respects their intelligence and wisdom because you asked that question to them. So it's actually a really good exercise in building relationships. And then on the counterpoint of that, a lot of people feel the need to sort of prove that they're the smartest person in the room, which means that they will throw around jargon terminology that a lot of people won't understand just to be the smartest person in the room. And something brilliant that can kind of come out of asking direct questions is sometimes they don't know what they're talking about. And you can immediately identify that if you ask direct questions. So yeah, in every possible circumstance, asking good questions, I think, is brilliant and great feedback. I love that we're talking about that. Sorry, Kelsey.
Oh, it's okay. I feel like the explain like I'm five and great questions is a really good thing, because I think if somebody can explain it to you in the simplest possible way, it means that they understand very well as well. And someone incapable of explaining something to you in a way that you don't understand, it's not necessarily a failing on your part for not understanding. That was something that I learned quite early on. It's funny because I also do the explain like I'm five thing, Leigh. That's something, it's like, I think it's very common, especially if you're not from necessarily a technical background and you have to understand lots of moving parts of a thing. As a community manager, there's so many different things that you touch and there's so many things that you just don't understand. And I learned pretty early on that I had to ask questions, otherwise I was just going to drown. And so just not being afraid of doing that is really, really important, I think.
I would even add, I think the role of asking questions is definitely one of the most important things you could do. I would even say there are no stupid questions, because you'll get people who are so, they're like, oh my God, can I ask you a stupid question? And I'm like, any question that you ask, if I hear the same question even like 10 times, I know that something isn't being communicated. So that helps me to find the pain point and hopefully fix it. So, when someone new starts at my studio, we'll tend to just write down what they're saying. If they ask the same question repeatedly, we're like, okay, do we have a document that addresses that particular question? And usually it's like, no, we don't. So it's in fact a very good question that we assume they know about, but they don't. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to be like, hey, I don't have the information, give it to me. So yeah, asking questions is so important and you should never be afraid to do so, even if you feel like it's going to make you sound stupid. I think someone who asks the right questions and even the stupid questions, I think is definitely much more brave than someone who pretends that like they know everything. And I'll immediately have more respect for someone who's like, I just need the information, give it to me, 100%.
It's interesting how so much of what we're talking about so far is just about how to communicate with other people and ask questions and talk. That it really is the backbone of what makes everything work. Like there's several times actually in the game that we've been working on where it's become apparent that we're talking about something which is unique, and that makes sense because we're making things that don't exist yet. So we often need to describe things that don't have names. So there was like one example I can think of is when we were trying to make things break apart, and there are some things which, when they get shot, they just explode into a bunch of little pieces. There are other things that could explode or could not explode. So maybe a part of them falls off. Maybe one thing is a bit load bearing compared to another. And it was becoming like Byzantine to try and figure out what people were talking about when they were talking about all the different ways that something might break. So we ended up just, no pun intended, breaking it down and creating like a mini glossary and going, okay, so we have these things here, which we'll call fracturables, these things here, which we'll call compound fracturables, these ones, which are prop destructibles, these ones, which are da-da-da. And then from that point on, whenever we were communicating with each other, we would try to capitalize those terms as just a subtle reminder that this is a formal definition that we've come up with and agreed upon. It's happened several times just in the last couple of years. So it's, if you're finding there's a miscommunication, I would strongly urge people to start thinking, okay, how can we refer to this thing moving forward as a good touch point?
I think there's something to be said about like the strength of an organization is not having assumed knowledge, because when there's a concept I like to think about, which is your company's knowledge. Most companies' knowledge is contained within their employees. You can't expect to retain absolutely all of your staff. So if it's all in their heads and they leave, that chunk of company knowledge has left with them. But that if you have good documentation, you've got a wiki or something that is always documented on and filed away and easy to access, and it's like then your company knowledge is solid. And that's going to run a lot better than the assumed knowledge that with employees that can leave.
There's something else. Sorry, I know I've been talking a fair bit, but just off the back of that one, there's one thing that I think I see a lot in more junior people where they really want to try and be the holder of as much knowledge as possible because that increases their value, which means that no one can get rid of them. And that's like something that comes from a place of insecurity of being like, oh no, I need to have as much knowledge as possible, ideally knowledge that other people don't have so that my job is secure. But the more valuable that you can be more valuable to an organization by having a whole bunch of knowledge that you share freely with other people. And if you're good at taking things you know and evangelizing them so that other people know them as well, then you're many times more valuable than you would be if you were highly technically skilled but didn't share your knowledge. Every time that you tell someone else how to do something, then it's, teach a person to fish, that sort of thing. So it's a mentality that you really kind of need to iron out sometimes. Sharing is caring.
I think an interesting way to think about it is a lot of people that assume that being irreplaceable is a way to retain your job. But the reality is the people who, like you said, evangelize and share that knowledge and grow their teams around it, they're the people who get promoted. So like a very silly way that I like to explain it is Jenga, is that if you are the immovable piece that if anyone tries to move, it shuts down the whole tower. It's like, well, you'll never get promoted. But if you're flexible, you get put at the top. So
yeah, and it might be because obviously my industry is very soft skills based, where I come from particularly. It's not very heavy on the technical side, but having that ability to meld the whatever technical skills you have, whatever you've gone to university for, whatever you've trained in, but being able to marry that up with the soft skills of being able to communicate effectively and, as Leigh was saying, sharing that with other people. I think that is what separates people that can really kind of progress to really great heights in their career with people that don't necessarily reach that. All of the people that I know that have gone fantastic places, it's been on the strength of their ability to collaborate rather than their specific talents.
All right, so I'm going to round that question off there. That was awesome. I really think we got into the meat and potatoes of that. That was great. So next question is, I'm going to direct this at Angus. So this is, what's something that initially you thought would be relatively easy, but then ended up being quite difficult?
Sure. Yeah, as a freelancer, I think something that I didn't anticipate was that I was going to be working with people overseas a lot. And that means at the start of my day, I need to be sure that I have all the information I need, because there's a good chance that the people that can answer my questions are going to be literally sleeping and unavailable. So yeah, just knowing all of the details that I will need to know to accomplish a task when that task is posed to me is something that's taken a lot of work to get good at. And it's the first thing that I think about whenever someone asks me how to do something is give me all the information, everything that could possibly come up with me. Otherwise, you'll find yourself blocked at the start of your day, which is maybe not so bad if you work in a studio and you can go ask the person, but it's horrible as a freelancer because then that's your whole day. You just have to well, I'll send off the email and I guess I don't get paid today. So yeah.
Did anyone else on the panel have any thoughts about just something that originally you thought was going to be a cakewalk that ended up being quite difficult?
Yeah, I think something that I assumed very early on, I always assumed that kind of reflects what Kelsey was saying, where everyone knows what they're doing and everyone knows what they're making, which is in fact not true at all. In game development, it is complete. To me, every time a game is shipped, it's like a small miracle, essentially, because you don't know what you're making until you made it. And part of that is, one, agreeing what the priority should be. That's a really big one. So maybe personally you think that this particular feature is really, really important, and then everyone else disagrees with you. And that is a learning process, how to vouch for this particular feature that you think is more important. and that sort of, you know, push and pull and how to resolve that. The other thing would be circulating information to everyone. So obviously the bigger the team, the harder it becomes, but even on a small scale, most studio is about 10 people, and constantly, you know, I'm hearing things that people below me don't know about. And because they don't know about this, they get confused, they get frustrated. They think that we don't really have a plan, but we do. So learning how to communicate that information is really important. And then the last thing is feedback. Like for me, I always knew that feedback was going to be something a little bit more difficult to manage, but I always thought that, you know, after 2, 3, 4 years, you have like an exact method on how to communicate feedback. But it really is a per person experience. Because some people, you know, like I find that technical people, programmers, if you tell them, hey, I think this particular feature isn't very good or doesn't fit our needs, they'll be very receptive and they're like, okay, tell me how to make it better. If someone is more creative, our team especially, it's usually very difficult to be like, hey, you put your 100% in, it was really, really good, it just doesn't fit what we need. And how to formulate that and say that in a way that it's positive and doesn't leave them feeling frustrated is definitely, it's like a learning process even until now. So yeah.
Receiving feedback never gets easy. I did for unpacking 3 years, we were working on it, and periodically, maybe every month, I would sit down with the art director, Ren, and we would just go through everything that I'd done. And every time it felt brutal, even if they were like totally reasonable, I agree with everything. It just feels bad to get that kind of feedback. And it's hard to receive. Even honestly, every time you get to the end and you're kind of exhausted, then afterwards you look back at the feedback, you're like, oh, that's actually not that different to what I already did. Yeah, the feedback thing, it doesn't get easier, but the best thing is to, like, in the moment, realize like you're just having an emotional reaction and try not to push back against the feedback you're receiving, and be receptive to it. And then afterwards, if you have any problems with what they said, maybe go back. But yeah, try to just listen when someone's giving you feedback.
And I think that's coming from somebody who wants the best for you and is a collaborator on the project. The part that I've found is really, really difficult is players are very, very vocal about what they like and don't like, and they don't have any ties to you that make them anywhere near as gentle or supportive. I mean, they can do. There are plenty that do, but I tend to find that for every 9 players telling me they love my game, it's the one person who says your game's broken that makes me to go, oh no, guess I'm not sleeping tonight. That sounded sarcastic, but like literally that one person just sticks in there. But I think the thing that I thought would be easy but ends up being difficult is kind of that, because as a game designer, a lot of what I'm doing is listening to a lot of feedback, whether it's internal to this studio, with a different studio within the same company, from tests like focus tests, UX tests, that sort of thing. Getting through all of that feedback and figuring out how to change something that's going to make the most people happy, that's kind of the job a lot of the time for game design. But just because you've made the most people happy doesn't mean that the one person that still has a bad time with your experience isn't going to be there and be really vocal. So I think one thing that I've had to learn how to do over time is to encourage someone to give me feedback, even when they're saying, I have this experience again, it's still there, and I know that to fix that experience would cause 3 other experiences. And I could explain what I see as the follow-on effects of fixing that one problem, but there's only so many hours in a day, and there are like often dozens or hundreds of design decisions going on that are difficult to try and describe to everybody. So there's always a bit of a trade-off, and it must really suck as a player to hear, sorry, but you were considered one of the acceptable bad experiences. We know that what you've experienced is frustrating, but it's better for 99 other people, so we're going with it. No one wants to hear that. Finding a way to both listen to that on repeat, knowing you're not going to fix it, and make that a good exchange is very tricky.
It's real fun, actually.
Okay.
No, not really. It's definitely difficult. I would echo what everybody else has said here in terms of that being a core part of something that's difficult. I think the other thing, it's very related, but it maybe slightly different in that I think context is something that I never, it's not that I thought it would be easy, it's just I never considered it at all. And the application of context in the way that you communicate in an office, with your colleagues, with the people in the different office overseas, for those that work in AAA and have global companies, email versus a tweet versus, internally with the small group of influencers that you work with, the language that you use really has to dramatically shift. And I think that when I was first starting my career, that's not something I ever really considered. And I think a lot of us tend to do it a little bit naturally, but in a workplace, particularly in the games industry, where we tend to be quite casual, the juxtaposition is quite intense when you have to get into professional mode. And for me, it's something I struggled with for a really long time, is working out the context and how it's different. But yes, dear Sir Ma'am, I hope this tweet finds you well. Very true.
Awesome. I really like that we keep coming back to this idea of like communication and feedback, because that is just one of those big things like that people just tend to overlook when they're like, oh, cool job in games. It's like, oh, you got to work really well with your team, because at the end of the day, I was like, you are making art, which means everybody is personally attached to whatever decision that they made, and they're gonna get precious about it. And then on the, when you're in the receiving side of feedback, you can't react on first emotion. You've got to assume whoever's talking to you is talking to you with the best intentions. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my next question now, which is for Leigh. What do you think the key differences are between indie and AAA?
Yeah, so this was an eye-opening one when I made that jump myself. So when I was an indie, I spent a lot of time doing all manner of things that I wasn't expecting I would have to do. It was paying contractors and sorting out financial stuff, doing a lot of tax, spending a lot of time trying to pitch people or network to drum up a bigger network of people that I could draw upon to help me get games finished and get them over the line. And when I started working in AAA, it was really different, because I think when I was in indie, I didn't necessarily fully understand the distinction between being a game designer and being a game producer. Now I do. Like, coming here and finding that there were people whose entire job was to make sure that you weren't being distracted by a million different things, and you knew exactly what you needed to do, and the thing that you were doing was the most important thing you could be doing right now. Like, I don't have to worry about where the money is coming from at a large studio. I don't necessarily have to be thinking about what the roadmap looks like for 3 months from now, as long as I'm focused entirely on this one piece, which is simultaneously kind of like liberating and also a little bit scary, because not knowing requires that you have a lot of trust in the people who are doing those roles. So that's a really important component of it. And again, really good communication skills from producers is vital so that they can engender that trust in the people who they're producing. But for me, I just found it really strange. Like, I sort of was sitting at my desk going, what do you mean I just sit here and focus on designing this armor system? What about everything else? You're telling me I can just do that and you'll just give me money for it? That's weird. How's this business still afloat? But yeah, it was a hell of a change, but a really welcome one.
I think the inverse of that, as someone who's pretty much exclusively worked for the AAA with the occasional freelance contract on the side here and there, I think one of the challenges that happens when you're in big organizations is there are processes that you have to follow, even if those processes are inherently dumb. Even if you can see a better way to do a thing, that it doesn't matter. You have to follow the process that 8 other people have to also follow, and there's a bureaucratic process. So in the the inverse of things, it can sometimes feel frustrating, particularly if you're making a jump from being someone who's used to being quite independent or making decisions on your own, having to make those decisions collaboratively, having to wait for someone to say yes to like a very basic thing, can be frustrating, particularly for young people that come into the big corporations that I've worked for. It's once you get used to it, it's totally fine. You learn the system and you can work it, but before that point, it's certainly difficult for some.
I've never worked in AAA necessarily, but I've worked with a lot of indies, from, you know, some guy that has some money set aside to build a game on the side of his programming job, up to, you know, Witchbeam making a successful game with a bunch of people that have worked in AAA, and the processes and just knowledge that people have, and I assume this is probably better in AAA generally, of what everyone else is doing and what everyone else needs. It makes a huge difference to have people around you that can tell you what to do, that have systems set up that will keep you in the loop, will keep the whole team working. I mean, you don't get that in indie all the time, especially as a freelancer. You can work with people that have absolutely no idea what an artist even does really, and that can be a lot harder to work with than a studio where you have a producer that gives you exactly what you need. And yeah, it's definitely harder as an indie, not having that institutional experience in the team, because you can end up with a very small number of people that have very limited knowledge about what it takes to get a game done.
And can I ask a question, Angus? Do
Sure.
you find that as a freelancer, sometimes the exchange is much more straightforward, and it's we require X amount of art for a game. This is all you need to know in order to produce that art, but there's a limited investment or engagement there? Or do you find that you're still brought in as a collaborator and a contributor to the team in a meaningful way, or does it vary project to project?
It does vary, but like most of the projects I've worked on are the former. Like a lot of times people want to just bring you in because, like, let's be honest, they don't have much money, and every second that they spend talking to you is money they have to pay. So they really want to get you on the job with the least amount of meetings and getting you involved in the project as possible. So you can end up with, I mean, most of my jobs start with somebody saying, can you make the main character for my game? They are kind of like this, and it's like a platform game, and that's all you get. And it can be really hard to design a character when you don't know anything about what you're making. But that's an expectation a lot of people come to me with, because they don't have that much money to build a character. I mean, in AAA, I think making the main character can cost a lot of money, and that's not always available to indie developers. So yeah.
I've never personally worked in AAA. My only experience with like a big structure or hierarchy was I worked for a couple of years in architecture. So there was like, 100+ people, lots of processes, which is very different from what I had in indie, which to me, it's like, first, the resources you have available. Obviously, you have a lot more resources in AAA, which is nice because, like Leigh said, you don't have to worry about, oh, this one feature is it's not going to deserve all the attention that it probably needs. So you don't really have to balance that out. I think the other thing is the emotional investment, because in an indie context, you have so much more agency over what you do. It's like a double-edged sword, because yes, you can make whatever you want in terms of the creative decisions and the production part of it. The other problem is that when other people come around and they change things that you've made, all of a sudden, because you have ownership over everything, you become it's very hard to let go of that control. And it's kind of, it's a double-edged sword, because you want everything to be the best product that you can, but other people might disagree. And this is where you have a lot of tension. Whereas I imagine in AAA, you don't really have that. It's sort of like the higher ups tell you, this is what we need. You get it done. So that's probably more of a smooth process. I guess the other
I
expectation
wish I
is
could say that was true, but in my
really?
experience, there's a lot of back and forth. Like the brief that Angus described can often be as much of a brief as we'd get in a AAA space, and I think that's kind of healthy. Like the direction that we get is, this is the problem we're trying to solve, and then there's trust that we'll be able to bring our expertise to bear on solving that problem, and that's good. But it does also mean that we have those same problems with sometimes our vision for how to solve it might differ than the vision of someone who's the executive director of something, and we need to reconcile that or convince them that we've made the right call. And often even just getting into that point where you're having the meeting about being able to convince someone is a process in itself.
Yeah, I feel like, to echo Leigh there, I think one thing that would be different, I imagine, is, at the end of the day, there is a certain freedom in being able to be like, this is someone else's decision. Like, this is above my pay grade, as I'm sure a lot of people have heard in the past. I think one of the other pieces of things that I've learned personally to be able to kind of like go, oh, this is how I progress in my career, and I've really found a lot of value from it, is learning how to work out a solution to a problem myself. Because I think what tends to happen when you're quite early on in your career, especially in AAA, is you'll wait for someone else to give you an answer. And that can happen. But I think again, another way that people often progress is in working out a solution and providing that solution to management of, hey, here's what I think we should do. That is in and of itself a difficult process, but it's a really valuable skill to learn. And I think that like a lot of people in indie and a lot of people that are freelance that's kind of like a live or die kind of mechanism, whereby if you don't work it out, there's a big problem. Whereas in AAA, it's more like, this is how you get ahead. And it's not the end of the world if you can't figure something out on your own, perhaps.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to round out to our final question now, which I'm going to direct at Kelsey, which is, what is something you wished all students knew getting into games?
This one, it's funny because I take a course on the side at university, just because, I decide to load up my life with way too many things. But I did a group assignment recently, and I found myself doing that thing that everybody does, which is cursing the group assignment. And then I kind of realized that the group assignment actually is the only thing that stays past university. Life is essentially a group assignment. There will be people that will, come in and give all the stuff, and they'll contribute really well to the task. There'll be people that'll rock up like the day before it's due with nothing, and you just kind of got to roll with it, unfortunately. I think that's probably the biggest misconception, is that after uni, the group assignments end. They do not. I'm so sorry to say.
I had a different thing that I think students should know, especially in an industry like games where there's a lot of passion involved, is that you really need to learn to take care of yourself and not give everything to your job. You should make sure you stay rested and you work a sane number of hours to keep yourself healthy, because you want to make the best things you can, but to do that, you're gonna have to keep doing what you're doing every day for a very long time. It takes years to make games, and if you don't treat yourself well, you're not going to be able to make it to the finish line of one game, let alone continue to work in this industry for hopefully your whole life. So
and I think there's a misconception that being overworked is the domain of AAA, but that passion that everyone who wants to get into making games has can lead to just as many kind of destructive tendencies of overworking when you're working on a solo project as it can in a big group environment. In fact, there's even a greater risk because so much more of the burden of making that small project a success falls on you. The whole project is divided by maybe 2 or 3 or 5 people as opposed to 500.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure to do that whenever you have free time. If you're working on something and you don't have a lot of work hours, you don't have an office, it's hard to take a day off and not feel like, oh, I could go on my computer and do some programming or do some art for a couple of hours, and that's fine. It's just a weekend. But yeah, like setting boundaries is really important because like burnout is real and it hits hard.
I think for my answer to that question, it would just be to make sure you're doing things other than playing games. I think it's really common for students to get into things and think, you know, I know so much about games, and that's fantastic. You should, but you can learn, like when you get into a space where you're going to make a game, you might not necessarily like that genre of game, and not liking a particular genre is a pretty significant chunk of ignorance. But someone who's good at being a game designer will be able to just immerse themselves in that genre, learn the trappings, and then figure out what needs doing. But I think if you know, if everything that you consume is just games, and nothing else, then you're probably going to be able to get good at making games that fit within certain genres or conventions. But if you've got a wider pool of experience to draw from, and you deliberately try and make sure that you've got a lot more interesting and varied things going on in your life or coming into your life, that's going to make for more interesting things that you make. That's true whether it's games, film, books, whatever the case may be. But yeah, go broad and go as find a diverse set of interests. That'd be my advice.
I think for me, I would recommend for any student who's looking to be into games, develop your skill to be able to justify decisions in a less emotional way. Because I find that because it's a creative field, you get very attached to all the stuff that you make. Other people are very attached to what they make. And so you're going to be conflicting a lot. So if you're able to justify a process or a decision that you've made in a more logical way, I think people tend to respond much better to that. Because, you know, to kind of echo what Leigh said, if you like a particular genre and you say, well, I think it's a great decision because I know a lot about this genre and all of those games have it, I think that's not as strong an argument as saying, okay, from a design perspective, it makes sense. There's clearly a market for it. And then you show numbers, you know, like having that emotional detachment to a point, I think is a very helpful thing to have. So would definitely recommend that everyone does it at some point.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to round it out there. So we're going to go to the Q&A now. So first of all, I'd like to thank my wonderful panelists. Thank you so much, Cyrian. Thank you, Leigh. Thank you, Angus. Thank you, Kelsey. This has been wonderful.